Bill, I think in the books that you've written about screenwriting, that you've become famous for two adages. One of which is that nobody knows anything,
Mm.
and the other is that screenplays are structure.
Nobody knows anything. It's funny. It's caught on. And as I remember, what I meant by it was that nobody has the least idea what movie's going to work. I mean, the big movie that's opening this weekend is Sex and the City 2. And nobody has the first one was a freak hit, and people loved it. And now they've done the sequel. And sequels are horror movies, as I've written. The only reason you do a sequel is to make money. And nobody has the least idea, is it going to be a phenomenal success or is it going to be is it going to tank? I was talking with a studio guy recently, and he said, we'll make movies that cost under 25 million and movies that cost over 75. And I thought, total horseshit. What he meant was they would make, quote, quote, an art film, and they would make special effects movies. But that leaves out a gigantic percentage of what most of us fell in love with movies for. I mean, it wasn't because of the special effects stuff that they're doing now. I understand that Avatar was terrific, et cetera, but there were other things besides Avatar. It was the movies I liked a lot. I started my first screenplay, I think, in 1964. I mean, I don't know that Tom Cruise was alive in 1964. If he was, he wasn't alive. And it was such a different world then, because now the numbers are so terrifying. The studios, I think, from what I'm told, are scared shitless because the amount of money that they're spending on movies. I mean, the first movie really that I did was Harper, and it had Paul Newman, bless him, who was, I guess, the biggest star in the world then. And I think it cost $3 million. Well, you figure that was a long time ago. But it's still, you can't get a major star's gym teacher for $3 million today. It's just, the prices are, I think the big change that's happened right now is the money. And I don't know if it'll ever go back to being where it was a little bit more sane. I think if you're a kid and you want to start out in movies, you used to be able, when I began in the 60s, you could pretty much write anything you wanted to write and pray. Because they weren't, they wanted romantic comedies, which I guess they do now. I thought Date Night was terrific. But they don't really, they wanted Westerns. They don't want Westerns anymore. I mean, it's very limited as to what they're making because they're panicked, as I would be too if I were running a studio, because they have no idea what's going to work, and they've got to keep making their stuff, and they just don't know. I mean, it always was a crapshoot, but now the numbers are so I think the numbers are the biggest difference. Mm-hmm. And if I were a young screenwriter now, you can only write, this sounds so rabbinical, but you can only write what you give a shit about. And you've got to keep doing that. If, for example, you don't like special effects movies, don't try and write one because it'll suck. And for example, I don't like special effects movies. I mean, I love Jaws, but for the most part, I don't like, all the things coming down from the planet to kill us and all that stuff. And it would be ridiculous for me to try and write one. You've got to try and write something you care about. That sounds really corny, but it's true. When I started, there weren't film schools. I never saw in my life, not even for a second, I never saw a screenplay until I was 33 years old. And a lot of kids are finished with their careers when they're 33 because they've been to film school, they got their first movie done when they were 23 or 25, and then now that they're 33, they're directors or whatever else. And it was a different world. And when I first heard of film schools, I thought it was the stupidest fucking idea I'd ever heard of. Why would anybody, because we fell in love with movies by going to the Alcyon Theater in my little town in Illinois. And then you went to the movies and they were wonderful. And then, now movies are important, which they never were when I was a kid. I was born in Chicago in 31, lived there for 6 years, then we moved to Highland Park. And I have childhood amnesia, so I have no memories whatever of the first 6 years of my life. I have very few memories of the early years at all, but the Chicago years, and I wish I knew what it was like then, were totally blocked. My father was in the clothing business, and my mother was his wife. Mm-hmm. And he worked for a company. Sears, Roebuck, and Montgomery Ward were the two biggest, and my father worked for the third, which was not a giant company, and he was always coming to New York and on clothing business, et cetera, et cetera. And then it was a family business. And my mother, who was much more powerful than my father, became convinced that my father would never be made head of the company because it would be a family business and they would screw him. So she made him retire, which I don't think he wanted to do, and start his own business. And he did. And his alcoholism got out of control. And his partner in the new business, which he started, which was doing well, closed the business because my father was a hopeless drunk. And then he came home to live. For the last 4 years of his life, he lived upstairs in the house as I was growing up. And then he killed himself when I was 15, and I found his body. And no, I've never written about it. Mm-hmm. But it was a very fucked up childhood.
And yet there was something in that childhood, there was something in your upbringing that inculcated, both you and your brother both became writers.
Yes. Unusual.
Very unusual. And you went to the theater as a kid, I know, not to mention the Alcyon, but
I
also the legitimate
We
stage.
did a lot of theater going. My parents liked the theater.
Mm-hmm.
And we would go to see road companies of whatever hit musical was in town. And I would see, and then we came to New York twice, and saw a lot of theater, and I loved theater. I still do. It's just when it's wonderful, it's better than anything, but it's not wonderful so much. And you have to basically pray when you go that it's going to be something that you'll have memories of. And like that. So my upbringing was very fucked up. Mm-hmm. And I guess I might as well talk about my writing. I showed no signs of talent. I showed no signs of talent. And the fact I've been a writer for half a century and more now is insane to me still.
You were at Oberlin.
I was at Oberlin, but when I went to Oberlin, we had a literary magazine, and I was the fiction editor, and there was a poetry editor and an overall editor. And everything was submitted anonymously. And these two girls were just brilliant. And when I would submit my short stories to be published which I was the fiction editor. And they would, and it was all anonymous, and they would look at it, and I was, so nervous my story was coming up. And they would say, well, we can't publish this shit. And I would say, no, we can't publish this shit. And I never got anything published. I think I must have somewhere in my life 100 rejection slips from magazines. And no one had the least interest. I never got a little thing back saying, show us your next story. I remember once, this can't be true, but I think it is. I submitted something to the New Yorker, a short story, and I got it back the same day. Now, the mails are not that good. But I remember, as I opened my mailbox, there was this fucking story that I just sent out to the New Yorker. And I took a writing course at Northwestern and got the worst grade. I took a short story course at Oberlin and got the worst grade. And my dearest old friend is a fabulous figure in my life, John Kander, who has had an amazing success in Broadway. Kander and Ebb, they wrote Chicago and Cabaret and New York, and Johnny was there. And I remember Kander saying one day we were having coffee, and that we had to submit a story the next day, and I'd written mine for weeks and been working on it. And he said, well, I got to go back to my room now and write the story. And I said, you haven't started it yet? And he didn't. And Johnny got B's and A's, and I got C's. And I was a very bad student at Oberlin. And I went in the Army in '52. Everybody was drafted. And in those years, the Army was 16 weeks of basic training, 8 weeks of learning to throw a hand grenade and marching and how to use your rifle, and 8 weeks of something else. And because I knew how to type, I was sent to clerical school. And there were 7 of us that day who arrived in clerical school the same day, and we were all college kids. And the head of the clerical school was a captain who was a golf nut. And he realized heaven had just come because he would have the 7 of us run the clerical school while he played golf every day. And he wrote a letter to the Pentagon requesting we be taken out of pipeline and be given to the clerical school for the next 2 years because we were fabulous. And he wrote this bullshit letter. And the Pentagon got the letter. There was a famous story in World War II about the 5 Sullivan brothers who were sent overseas after basic training, and the ship was sunk, and they were all 5 killed. And the government felt that was unfair pain. So they passed a rule, which I think is still in effect, that everybody after basic training in the military gets 2 weeks to go home. And so we all went home, the 7 of us, for 2 weeks, and then met at the Pentagon. And we had discovered the Pentagon had gotten the letter and thought, if we were so fabulous, they wanted us at the Pentagon. So we were sent to the Pentagon, and in those 2 weeks, the jobs they had for us were filled. So they were going to keep us there until the next levy to Korea happened. And it never happened because the Korean War was ending. So the 7 of us had nothing to do for essentially 22 months. And I mean, it was amazing. The people who ran, the civilians who ran our offices loved us because the more people they could have working for them, the higher their ranking would be in the civilian world. So we had nothing. And I remember I was given jobs. I was given one job to do, to make abbreviations up for every job title in the Army. And I remember I made the Washington Post on that, not by name, because some of my abbreviations were longer than the job titles. And they thought, what kind of an asshole did this?
And years later, the Washington Post would become very important.
Anyway, I would write shorts. We were at Fort Myer, Virginia, across a little thing from the Pentagon, and every night I would go to the Pentagon and write my short stories. And I never got anything published. It was just horrible. And then after military, I came to New York, and I was going to Columbia, but my grades at Oberlin were so shitty I couldn't get into Columbia, so I got in on pull. The head of the music department, a wonderful man named Douglas Moore, got me in. And I got a master's at Columbia, and I didn't know what I was going to do with my life. And then I thought, I know what I'll do, I'll get a PhD, but then I realized I have no language skills. And it would have been an extra 2 years to learn 2 languages. And I was living with my brother, who was at this point a failed playwright. We're all in our 20s, and Kander, who was not successful yet. He was giving voice lessons. And I realized I'd gotten a master's, and I wanted to be a writer. I'd shown no signs of talent. No one ever had the least notion that I would succeed as a writer. And I went back to Highland Park, and in a frenzy of 3 weeks, I wrote my first novel. And I remember so clearly, I was on page 50, and I'd never been on page 20 before because the short stories were all short. And I wrote the novel. I had met a guy in the Army who had met an agent. So I called up the agent who was just starting, a wonderful man named Joe McCrindle. And I said, can I send you my novel? And he said, sure. And he knew an editor at Knopf, and he sent the novel to the editor. And they had a very odd reaction to it. They said, we'll publish it if you'll double it in length, which was very strange. So I went frantic and I doubled it in length and sent it back and was waiting to hear. Now, I'd never had anything published, ever, ever, ever. I had shown no signs of talent. And I got a phone call that morning. I was alone in the apartment in New York that they had accepted the book. And Candor came home about 2 hours later, and he said, "Have you heard about the book?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, and I said, "They're going to publish it." And he said, "Oh, Billy," he's the only one who calls me Billy, "isn't that wonderful? Is everyone thrilled?" And I said, "I haven't told anybody." And he realized I'd been walking around having a catatonic fit because I didn't know how to deal with this news. And Candor said, "Would you like me to help?" And I said, "How would we do that?" And he'd say, "Well, we'll sit at the desk and I'll call people and dial them and tell them your book was taken and that you don't want to talk about it. And you can say, 'Isn't it wonderful?' And they would say, 'Yes.' And then we dial the next person. And that's what we did. We dialed everybody we knew and said, 'Billy's book has been taken.' And that was how I started. And I still am staggered. No one remotely thought I could ever succeed as a writer. And when I'd gotten my master's, the only job offer I got, I think, was from a high school in Duluth, Minnesota, that said I could come and teach English. And I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to go to Duluth and teach English. And probably what would have happened to me was I had an uncle then who was in advertising in Chicago. And I think probably he could have gotten me some kind of menial job at an ad agency. And then I wrote the novel and that changed everything. But it's still freakish to me that any of this happened. I felt they'll find me out. And what I had to do was write a novel every year. So the next year, because, what I did was I was living in New York and I'd go to the movies every day because it was possible. It was wonderful. 42nd Street at that time had 17, I think, movie theaters that showed double features. And you could go down to, it hadn't become dirty yet. And I'd go down there. I didn't know there was a double feature house that played Westerns and one that played comedies. And, you could go see anything, foreign film double features. And that's really those years where I got my movie education seriously. I went to the movies all the time when I was a kid, but I just went to a shitload of movies those years. And I wrote a novel. That was, Temple of Gold came out in 57, then I had a novel came out in 58. Then I went to Broadway, which is a disastrous thing for anybody to do. I had a novel in 1960, and then I wrote I wanted to write a long novel. Don't ever write a long novel. And it took me a long, long time. It was a book called Boys and Girls Together. Eventually it changed a lot of things in my life. And I had gotten it was 1,000 pages typed. It was a long fucker. And I had gotten halfway through. I stopped for 1.5 years to do theater. And when I came back, I was blocked, which is every writer's nightmare. And I didn't, I had 600 pages typed, and I didn't know what to do. And one day, I read an article, I think in the Daily News. The big crime at this time was the Boston Strangler. And the new theory in Boston was that there might be 2 Boston Stranglers. And as I was walking up to my office, a notion never happened before, maybe once again. An idea dropped into my head, which never happens, which was, what if there were 2 stranglers, and what if one of them got jealous of the other? And I called up some friends and said, I've got this idea for a novel, but I want to write my long novel. And they said, well, if you can write this Strangler book quickly, why don't you do that? Maybe you'll get you juiced up to finish up the long book. And so I wrote the Strangler book in 10 days. And it became a novel, and it became a movie. It was called No Way to Treat a Lady. And the reason I'm going on about this is I wanted to make it seem longer than it was. So I had a ton of chapters, because each new chapter I could start on the top of the next page. And I think there were probably 50 or 60 chapters in a 150-page book. It was a weird-looking book. And the reason I go into this was because that's what got me in the movie business. A lovely actor named Cliff Robertson somehow got a hold of No Way to Treat a Lady. And he came to my apartment and he said, I read your screen treatment. And I remember thinking, shit, that wasn't a screen treatment, that was a novel. But because of all the chapters, and sometimes it would be a one-sentence chapter and then the next page. And he said that his career, his great successes had been on television, but that when the movies happened, he didn't get the parts. So he had optioned a marvelous short story called Flowers for Algernon by Daniel Keyes. And would I write a screenplay? And I had never seen a screenplay. And so he left. And I was talking to my wonderful then wife, Eileen. And I said, I've got to go down to Times Square. It was midnight or 1 a.m. and see if I can find what a screenplay looks like. So there were bookstores that were open late in Times Square in those years. And there was one, I don't know what it was, that was published at that time. And we're talking 64. And I bought it, and I brought it home, and I looked at the screenplay. And I realized I could never write in that form because the screenplay is all double space. Fade in on double space. Bill, double space. He is sitting in a chair, blah, all that bullshit. And I realized I could never write in that form. And I didn't. And then, for some reason, Robertson, I was writing the screenplay for him, but I hadn't done remotely anything on it yet, and he asked me to come over and doctor a movie, which I did for him. He was shooting a movie. I think Sean Connery was supposed to play the lead, and then he couldn't do it, so they had to, change the dialogue around. And I did that for a couple of weeks, and I came back, finished Flowers for Algernon, sent it off to Robertson, who fired me immediately. I'd never been fired, but it was a horrifying experience. And he got Sterling Silliphant to write him, and the movie was Charlie.
Right.
He won the Oscar. Not a sentence of mine was in the screenplay. But that's how I got in the movie business. It's all a fluke.
Huh.
I mean, if Cliff Robertson doesn't misread my novel and think it's a screen treatment, he never asked me.
Interesting.
And I said I was 33 years old, and I'd never, ever seen a screenplay. Nobody that has any interest in our business now can say that. There's a screenwriting convention that happens every year in California. And it used to be before the crash. Thousands of kids came from all over the world. And they would listen to, agents would come and people would, talk to them about how to make it in the movie business.
So how do you feel about that whole sort of orthodoxy of screenwriting, the books and the Robert McKee's and the...
Robert McKee, I remember I listened to him. McKee's very good. I mean, he really is a good speaker. I heard him once. I went and heard a lecture he gave. He's a very skillful fellow. There are no rules on this. Things happen. I mean, when I think of, there's no way if I wrote Butch Cassidy today, which is the most successful movie I ever have been or will be connected with, they don't make that movie. They don't make a Western. The only way they might make it is if Mr. Eastwood felt an urge to make a Western and he got together with George Clooney and he directed it, whatever, I don't know. But otherwise, they don't make Westerns. Westerns flop. I mean, John Wayne was the biggest star. John Wayne couldn't get arrested now. The greatest dancer that ever lived, Fred Astaire, couldn't get arrested now. What part have you seen in a movie that Fred Astaire could have played? They don't make Fred and Ginger movies anymore. They don't do it. It's all different. Mm-hmm. And when you think about those giant stars of my childhood, Gary Cooper, what is Gary Cooper going to do now? What is Jimmy Stewart going to do now? Are any of them going to get, they'd be on television. Mm-hmm. They'd all have TV shows. That would be how they earned a living. But I don't think And when you think of who the big star, we live in a time right now, 2010. I don't think this has ever happened in the history of sound. There's one movie star, and that's Will Smith. And yes, Johnny Depp put him in a pirate movie, sure, but Will Smith in anything, the way they look at movies out in Hollywood is, does the movie open? Which means the first weekend, does it do business? And the reason they pay stars these obscene amounts of money, or used to, was because they felt the stars would open the picture. Tom Cruise will open a picture. Well, he doesn't anymore. He has a movie coming out this summer. If it's a big hit, maybe they'll want Tom Cruise again. But it goes very fast. One of the reasons actors are the way they are is because it's not going to last, and they know it. And they know it, and it's scary for them.
You never moved out there. You never.
No, I don't like California. I have no sense of direction. I hate to drive. I had a wonderful summer, the Butch Cassidy summer, but that was a different world. You know, George Hill and I met every day at his office on the Fox lot for the day. And we talk about this and talk about that and this line and that line, and they wouldn't do that now. It was like the summer we spent working on the script. Then we had Redford and Ross and Newman in for 10 days, the three of them, just Hill and myself and the three actors. And they were all so gorgeous. And I remember I was walking back to Hill's office one day, and he said in a quiet rage, "I feel like a mutt." Because they, here were these three gorgeous, they are, and they were. And I think of the three, Ross was the best horseback rider. Uh-huh. I've always thought that. I've been told that.
Interesting.
But, and then we had the crew in for like 2 weeks. We had everybody in. We had the editor and the cameraman and blah, 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 talking, what problems do you have with this? What do you have? Are we going to have trouble making that work? Blah, blah, blah. So that when the shoot actually happened, the movie went like a dream, because we had had an amazing amount of work on the script and on location before the movie shot. They wouldn't do that today. The novel I mentioned, No Way to Treat a Lady, which was published, I think, in '64, was published under a pseudonym, Harry Longbaugh, which was the real name of the Sundance Kid. So this is 5 years before the movie came out. So I had obviously been trying to, there was not a lot about them at this point. We didn't know anything. We still don't know really anything about Longbaugh. We think he was born and brought up in New Jersey, and he was clearly as good with a gun as anybody at that time. And he went to South America with Butch Cassidy. Cassidy was a fabulous figure. There are only two figures in the history of the West who were famous at that time when they were alive. One of them was Jesse James, and one of them was Cassidy. Cassidy was so well liked. This happened. If he was being followed by someone, he would go up to your house and say, "Hi, I'm Butch Cassidy. The sheriff is after me. Can you hide me in the basement?" And they'd say, "Sure, come on in." But everybody loved him. He was this marvelous, strange figure who had no violence in him and never shot anybody until he went to South America. And he and the Sundance Kid were friends now. Why in the world? You know, it was wonderful material. And one of the great stories about, this is true. As a young man, he's in jail. And the governor of the state, and I'm going to say it was Colorado, says, "I'll make you a deal. If you promise me you'll go straight, I'll let you out." I mean, he was not in for murder. He was, whatever. "I'll release you from prison. All you have to do is tell me that you'll never commit crimes again." And Cassidy said, "I can't do that." He said, "But I'll make you a deal. If you'll let me out, I promise I'll never do anything in Colorado again." and the governor took the deal, and he never did anything in Colorado again. It may have been I don't know what state it was.
Yeah, it might have been Wyoming.
But he was, it may have been one, but he was an amazingly likable figure, Cassidy was. And that he had arguably the biggest gang, and he ran it. I mean, it's ridiculous. Why did they all follow Butch Cassidy? But they did, until Harriman. They robbed railroad. I mean, it's like the movie. I mean, I didn't make much of that up. They robbed railroad, and E.H. Harriman, who was a billionaire at that time, whatever the equivalent would have been, went nuts that Butch Cassidy kept robbing his trains. So he formed the greatest law outfit, and
the Super Posse.
The Super Posse.
Yeah.
And he had 6 guys from around the country who were the top lawmen in America. And he got them all together, and he said, all you got to do is capture Butch Cassidy. And when Cassidy heard about it, he realized they would kill him. So that's why he went to South America. I mean, the idea of going to South America was insane. But, you know, he was a wonderful figure. Not like really anybody else.
So you wrote it on spec, basically.
Yeah,
right?
but I tended to do that a lot. I wrote my novels on spec, et cetera, et cetera. That means not having a contract. But I wrote Butch on spec, and I had a very great agent named Everett Ziegler, and he decided to have an auction. And everybody turned it down except one studio. And they wanted a change, which was the studio guys said, they can't go to South America. We'll buy this if you don't have them go to South America. And I said, but they went there. And the studio guy said to me, I don't give a shit. All I know is one thing. And then this great line, John Wayne, don't run away. And of course, John Wayne didn't run away. It was a very unusual thing for a Western hero. It's one of the other things that made the story so wonderful. And so I rewrote it, changing almost nothing. And Ziegler auctioned it again. And every studio wanted it except one. And there was this insane auction. And I have to mention the number. It was sold to Fox, Richard Zanuck and David Brown, bless them, for $400,000, which now we're talking about, what, 1967, whatever it was. It was a shitload of money then, but it was really a freakish amount of money now. And it got in all the papers, because nobody at this time knew anything about screenwriters, because all they knew is that actors made up all the lines and directors had all the visual concepts. And the idea of this obscene amount of money going to this asshole who lives in New York who wrote a Western drove them nuts. There was the most vicious stuff. And when the movie opened, the reviews were pissy because they hated me. And the movie basically caught on and became what it became. But it was the writing of the screenplay and the amount of money that it went for that basically changed everything in my life. I think I'd written a couple of things that hadn't gotten made. Mm-hmm. And then Harper, and then there was something else, and then I wrote Butch. I mean, I wrote Butch. My second daughter was born in, I think, 65, and we moved to Princeton because I'd spent a little time. I didn't go to school there, but I spent a little time in Princeton.
You were teaching?
No, I was just basically out there. I became a teacher later, and we decided to move to Princeton. We were going to have a second kid. It's a great town, blah, 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 blah. And I'll tell this story. It's a huge change in my life. We moved to Princeton. I am planning to be a writer. A guy who I had met, who was the writing professor, came up to me and said, I have a chance suddenly for sabbatical. Would you take over and be the writing professor next year? Yeah, I've always thought I'd like to teach. Teaching writing at Princeton, there aren't that many kids that take writing. I'll do it. So I taught writing at Princeton, and at that was the I wrote Butch over Christmas vacation in Princeton, New Jersey. I mean, I've been working on it for I don't know how many years. And I tend, once I have the confidence that I know what I'm doing, to write quickly in movies. In other words, I don't know what it took me, 3 weeks, whatever it was. But I'd been working on it for X years, so you don't know. And I had done, apparently, a quality job in my teaching there that year. And I got the same guy who was come back said, would you take over and be the other writing teacher here at Princeton? And I thought, well, we like Princeton, so-and-so and so-and-so, yeah. So I was going to be a professor of writing at Princeton University. And I didn't hear from the guy, and I didn't hear from the guy. And finally I ran into him, and he said, oh, God, I've been avoiding you. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, there was a revolving head of the English department at that time. I have no idea if they still have it. And the guy who was the head of the English department that year, I had mentioned a book I wrote, the long book called Boys and Girls Together. It became a gigantic hit in paperback. And it was about a bunch of people, young people who come to New York and fuck up their lives. Boys and girls, gays and straights, all kinds of stuff. The guy who was the head of the English department that year said, I will not have our students, this is a direct quote, I will not have our students worshiping at the shrine of a pornographer. I mean, the son of a bitch called me a pornographer, and I'm such a nice Jewish boy, it's so ridiculous. And this was, I went back to Eileen. The kids were then born. I called Mr. Ziegler and I said, I am leaving Princeton. I don't know that I'll ever come back. You must get me something to do somewhere this summer. I don't care what it is. I want to doctor something this summer somewhere. Get me out of here. So we moved back to New York that week. I think in the 40-some years, I've been back to Princeton once, and I have no intention of ever going back. And it's a swell school and all that shit. And Zig got me a job, I think, in London, and we were off that week where I spent the summer, and I've lived in New York ever since. But it was, if either I think of the other two English heads had been running the department that year, it never would have happened. This one guy hated the book so much.
Wow.
And like that was a big, and that was a big deal because I was 33, 34 maybe, 35. And I had planned to be a professor. I really thought I was going to be that. And then that all changed. So I came to New York and I've been a writer ever since.
Interesting.
Yeah, fascinating for me.
Well, yeah, but luck. I mean, you know, the role of chance and
it's
chance,
amazing.
yeah, and chance favoring the prepared mind, though, at the same time. You said about those. One other question about Butch Cassidy, which is that you said that everything good from your Hollywood career came as a result of the cliff scene.
Well, it's from Gunga Din.
Mm-hmm.
I think, for me, the greatest movie ever made is a movie directed by George Stevens called Gunga Din, with Cary Grant and Victor McLaughlin and Douglas Fairbanks Jr.
And Sam Jaffe.
Sam Jaffe in the title role. And I went to see it at the Alcyon, and I remember I was so rocked by it that I went back the next day. And I remember in grammar school, everybody was stunned that I'd gone back to see a movie again. And I remember some kids said to me, how could you go again when you knew who won? Something like that. And I did. And Gunga Din, I've seen it now 16 times. My best Gunga Din story for me is the day I got out of the Army in 1954. I was back in the small town, Illinois, and there's an army post, Fort Sheridan, about 2 miles away. And a friend of mine who was getting out, and I called him, and I said, I'm back. When are you getting out? Blah, blah, blah. And he said, you'll never guess what's playing on the post tonight, Gunga Din. And I said, because I saw it every chance I ever got, and I knew it by heart, I said, I'll be there. And he said, there's a problem. You have to be in uniform. So the day I got out of the fucking service, I got back in uniform and snuck onto Fort Sheridan so I could see Gunga Din again. That's how much I loved it. I am moved. I've written this and I believe it's still true. I am moved for reasons I don't understand more than anything by what I call stupid courage. And the two best examples I know are I don't want to spoil the plot of Gunga Din, but at the end of Gunga Din, the heroes are all shot to shit, and the water boy, Sam Jaffe, is also wounded. And there's a tower, and the British troops are going to get massacred by the evil criminals. And Cary Grant says, the colonel's got to know. And he gives him a trumpet, and Gunga Din crawls up the Temple of Gold, which is what my first novel was called, and blows his bugle and gets killed, but the British are saved. And that was so moving for me. And the other thing that moved me out of control was one of the great musicals ever written is Porgy and Bess by the Gershwins. And Porgy is a cripple, and he's got a goat cart, and it's down south. And he's in love with the town beauty, whose name is Bess. And there is an evil person in the thing called Sport in Life, who's a drug pusher. And this is down south, and he convinces Beth to come to New York with him, and he gives her drugs, and they go off to New York. And Porgy's in jail because he has killed the town bully. And then he gets out of jail, and he comes back, and he's crippled, and he's on a cart. And you just sit there in the audience thinking, oh God, Bess is gone, what's he gonna do? He's got no life, he's a cripple, blah, blah, blah. And he says, where's Bess? And there's an embarrassment from the people, and then they say, she's gone, Porgy, she's gone to New York. And there's a pause. And he says 3 words. He says, bring my goat. And when I heard that, I got so hysterical because I realized fucking Porgy was going to go on his goat cart, having his goat pull him from the deep south to New York City. And I thought, oh my God. And I started to sob hysterically. And it's at the end of the show, and there's curtain calls and cheers. I'm still hysterical. And I can still remember when we left the theater, people would touch me, pat my head, and say to my parents, is he all right? Is there something wrong with your son? Because I couldn't stop hysterically crying. Mm-hmm. So that stupid courage moves me.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, the cliff scene in Butch Cassidy really is a Gunga Din.
Oh, it's total copy. I knew the Sundance Kid couldn't swim. I knew that because all those years I was doing research. I found out that most cowboys couldn't swim. It was not a thing that was part of their life. And I remember thinking, shit, that, and I clocked that away. And so when you come to the thing in Butch Cassidy, we're at the cliff, and they're about to get killed by the super posse. And Bush says, we'll jump, and the Sundance Kid says, I can't swim. That was a big fucking moment at the movies. People just shrieked, and then they jump off the cliff and say, horse shit.
And for me, it was like, and then when Newman says, well, it's the fall that'll kill you.
That's right, the fall will probably kill you. But that moment was one of the moments that, and the other moment I think they did die that way. There's a lot of dispute as to whether they were killed but I think the militia got them. And that last scene that they have when they're going to when Butch says, let's go to Australia, and then they go out and get shot. That worked because they never talk about the fact that there's a fucking militia out there and that they're bleeding to death as they speak and they're going to die. They just talk about, can we go to Australia? It's got nice beaches, whatever the dialogue is. And you could learn to swim, and the kid says swimming's not important. But here they are talking about going to fucking Australia, and they know they're going to die. And that's, again, for me, stupid courage. That worked. That worked, and it was... Oh, I got to tell a wonderful story. Halfway through shooting, Hill has me out to look at like the first hours of dailies that he's done, and it was wonderful. And we're going to the set after I'd seen hours and hours and hours and stuff. And it was just when they were going to Mexico for the South American sequence. And this is a directing story. We're walking to the set, and a guy walks past, and he's carrying a hat, and he says, hat okay? And Hill nods. And then we go on the rest of our walk, and suddenly Hill almost drops to his knees because he realized what the guy was saying, is this hat that I am showing you okay for South America? Because if he had it was the wrong hat. And if they had gone to Mexico and the Sundance Kid didn't have a hat that was the same hat that he was wearing in New York or wherever it was, they're fucked. They have to stop shooting. Someone has to fly from Mexico to Los Angeles, whatever. And I'll never forget that, because directors have that kind of problem. Because if there's a thing, if you need something and you're a director and you need this for a shot, you need that kind of crowd, that kind of hat, you better have it or you're fucked. I had Harper and Butch in the 60s. Mm-hmm. And there was other stuff, but I mean, those were the two. And then I'm trying to think, there was a long period, oh God, when was I a leper? I wrote about it. It was when I wrote The Season. No, it was when I wrote Adventures in the Screen Tray. Mm-hmm. And I hadn't realized it. I had basically, I had written some movies that hadn't gotten made.
Right.
And suddenly I was a leper, and the phone didn't ring.
Well, you wrote a great movie that I love, which is The Great Waldo Pepper.
Yeah, that was neat. That was for George Hill. Uh-huh. That was only because George loved old airplanes.
Right.
And whatever. No, but there was stuff. It's just, the interesting thing about Waldo Pepper, it was Redford and Hill again, and the advance hype was terrific. And we had a sneak in Boston. And I think it was Susan Sarandon's first big part, and she was wonderful. And there's a scene where she's trapped on the airplanes from the, old airplanes.
Biplanes, yeah.
And she's frozen on this airplane wing. And Waldo makes a plane-to-plane transfer and goes over and rescues her. But she loses her grip and she falls to her doom. The audience went fucking nuts. They felt so betrayed. I never felt more panic. I thought they might attack us, because there were people getting up and in a rage because we had done this. And the reason I mention this is today, if we had seen that, it's a half a day's reshoot. All you have to do is put her in the same dress, bobbing up out of the lake and waving her fist in anger up at Waldo. And she's fine. But we didn't do that then. We didn't do the reshooting, which happens now, which is a big part of movie making now. We didn't do that. Mm-hmm. And what are we talking about, 40 years ago? It was. I mean, we never thought, part of it was Hill, but we never thought of reshooting. It was never mentioned by anybody, we can do this. Because it's an easy reshoot.
I remember seeing it at the old Rivoli.
Right.
Yeah. So how did you learn? If you had not seen a screenplay before, and the ones that you saw were not...
I think, to be a rabbi again, I've been very lucky in that I've only written movies I want to write. In other words, when I got offered a special effects movie, I'd know I couldn't do it. And you can only do what you can do, I think. And that sounds so... But you know, the other thing that I wrote that caught on out there is screenplays are structure. You're telling a story. And you've got to basically... You've got to believe in the story. That sounds really corny, but you do. You can only write what you think you can make play. And I think for anybody who's starting out, if you try and do something that you don't give a shit about, you're not going to get it made. And I was very lucky in that the movies that I wanted to do got made for a long period. At least for the first 20 years of my career, they were all movies I wanted to write.
And you were never one for pitching? You never...
No, I only pitched once in my whole life.
Mm-hmm.
And I pitched for friends at Castle Rock, and I was so awful I quit after a few minutes.
Mm-hmm. I
couldn't, and, you know, it's my problem. I just couldn't do it. And, you know, I was very in demand for a long time out there because Harper was a hit. Great line. The producer of Harper, we went up to Newman's house in Connecticut, and I remember talking about the script, and we walked around the streets, the back streets of, I think, Westport, and he was, the two best stars I've ever worked with are Eastwood and Newman. They were fabulous. And I remember with Newman, he had pebbles, and every time a car would come by, he'd throw a pebble into the woods, so his back was to the car. So no one stopped and said, "Oh my God, that's Paul Newman." And he said he would do it, and we drove back into the city, and the producer said, "You don't know what just happened, do you?" And I said, "No, it's my first movie." And he said, "You just jumped past all this shit." And that was true, because Paul Newman said he'd do it, so the movie got made. He was that big a star in those days, and had a fabulous career.
Can you tell the story of the opening credits sequence for Harper? How that came to be and what it was?
I got a call from the director saying, "I don't like being on the set. First of all, I have a tendency to fuck up the shot. I tend to stand in an area where the camera's going to move. And it's boring for me. I never wanted to direct. I don't understand actors. I never remotely, except when I was in my, hot streak, whatever, and people would want me to direct. I would never want to do it. It was ridiculous. And the director said, "We need a credit sequence." And I thought, what the fuck, it was I didn't know about movies, but I knew what the credits were. They're those things that come at the start. And I thought, well, he's got to wake up in the morning. I'll write about him waking up. So I did, and I got the notion that he was out of coffee, and he was living alone. He was a detective, and he was living alone. He was divorced, whatever, had a miserable life, and he's out of coffee, so he has to make his coffee with coffee grounds from the garbage. And then he made his coffee, and there's a moment where he sips it, and then a look of sheer horror comes over his face. And when I went to see the movie, they were having a screening of it in New York, and I went to see it. There was this huge laugh, which I had not known was going to be there. And one of the reasons, I think, when Newman's face when he sips his coffee was a huge laugh. And that's what people were talking about. The movie was a big success, a good success. And one of the reasons it worked, I think, was that moment in the beginning when he makes that face. The audience just liked him from then on. The other story, which is true, when I went to see the screening, I walked in, and there was a guy at the door, and he didn't have my name. And he said, "Who are you?" And I said, "I'm the screenwriter." And he said, "I don't know if I can let you in." And Eileen said, "He's the screenwriter, for Christ's sake, he wrote it." So the guy let us in. But I mean, that was also a good example of the power of the screenwriter. Nobody wanted you around.
Well, you said that screenwriters rank somewhere between the man who guards the studio gate and the men who run the studio.
Yeah, I think that's,
Yeah.
it's an odd, most screenwriters, I think, are only doing it because they want to get on to other things. They want to direct. I think most screenwriters really want to direct, and I understand that because a director, A, makes more money, but B, has power. And you can, if you're lucky as a director and you have talent as a director, I mean, I think it's a terrible life, but it's better in many ways than being a screenwriter.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's not, movies are a very, very odd way to make a living.
Mm-hmm.
They really are, because for everybody, it's not just stars that lose it. Directors, nobody wants this director anymore. Nobody wants that writer. Nobody wants that editor. A lot of technicians have long careers. There was a great, great editor who just died, Dee Dee Allen. And she had been around, I mean, she didn't start till young because she was a woman and there was prejudice in those years. But, I mean, she had a wonderful run. But a lot of technicians, if they're really skillful cameramen and editors, can have long careers. There's a documentary out now about screenwriters. And what's interesting is screenwriters tend to tell the same story because most of us have the same experience. These are people who have had careers, but you have the same things that didn't work.
It's interesting you're talking about directors, though, because you talk about the perplexing, what you call the perplexing relationship between the writer and director. You say that the writer needs to be as supportive of the director as possible, yet you've also called them insecure, lying assholes.
Well, I think basically that's true. I mean, a lot of directors are wonderful people. Ron Howard, the two nicest people I've ever met in the movie business are Richard Attenborough in England and Ron Howard here, in terms of just plain nice, decent professionals. But most directors are, it's weird because it's hard doing it, because you don't, oh my God, you can't get this room. I thought we had this room sewn up. No, we don't have it. We have to go here. Or it's raining out. Or there's a million things that can go up that can screw up a director. And most directors, it's hard. I mean, George Hill is the best director I ever worked with. George didn't work that much. George would basically not work for like a couple of years and then would do 2 movies back to back. And why he worked that way, I don't know. I don't know. It was his rhythm. But it wasn't that he wasn't wanted, because he was offered everything. But I mean, it's a strange, and if you have a movie that's a flop and you're the director, they remember that. I mean, you got to look up people's careers. A lot of guys have a long time of years between work. It's because the last movie flopped. They don't want you.
So it's never been a desire on your part. You never had any desire to direct.
I would have died rather than direct.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't know what the fuck to say to an actor. You know, actors, one of the things about actors, it's true, like everybody else, even though they're cuter than we are, they're very insecure. And when an actor wants lines changed, you don't know, is he really saying, I don't like this line? Is he really saying, I want more lines? Is he really saying, I want everything in this scene to be about me? What are they really saying? I don't know. I mean, they're very peculiar. You know why? I don't know why actors say, yes, I'll do this part. I don't understand them. And they are what they are.
But in the case of Paul Newman,
yes,
and in Butch Cassidy, you had a great example of an actor saying, not worried about his co-star, not worried about the co-star getting more attention or getting more lines, or
no. But that was Newman. Newman was, I mean, he was a remarkable figure. I think one says such bullshit about actors. Oh, so-and-so is, but Newman really was. But I remember, this is an awful story. I wrote a movie in the 90s. It was a very successful Western named Maverick. And James Garner played Mel Gibson's, he turns out, his father. And I thought, shit, Paul Newman would have been great for the part because he looks like me. And I went to Mr. Newman and showed him the script, and he had some suggestions. And then he said, let's do it. And I remember he hit us dead. What the hell, let's do it. And then there was a pause. Now, this is Paul Newman. And he said, I hope they don't lowball me. Meaning, I hope the studio doesn't try and chintz me out of whatever my salary should be. And I said, that's not going to happen. It did happen. It did happen. They lowballed Paul Newman. And the big female star of that time was Meg Ryan. And they lowballed her. And suddenly Mel Gibson, I was told this, who was a giant star at this point, got in a rage because he didn't want to be the only star in the movie. So they went to James Garner that day, and he said yes, and Garner had been in the, and it was a very, very good. And they went to Jodie Foster and offered her more money than she'd ever been offered, and she said yes. So they suddenly, over a weekend, had their cast. But it was, why would they? I still don't know how anybody would lowball. How can you basically take one of the great figures in film history and offer him enough money less than he felt he wasn't a greedy man. And I don't know, it's a strange thing, but that was a horrible story because Newman was probably 70.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful looking, always,
Yeah, the eyes.
Everything.
Just everything.
Everything.
You said that if you had it all to do over again, you'd have written everything you've written except for All the President's Men.
Yeah, it was a terrible experience. It was a swell movie.
Mm-hmm. It is.
But it was it was just a complicated film. It was, I wrote about it once in a book. It was just, and that's another movie they don't make today. I mean, even if a big star wanted to make it, which Redford was then, a big star, it was just a very unpleasant experience. And the movie, it doesn't matter. The movie had some wonderful things, and I think the actors were swell, and we got through it. But it was here's the deal. It doesn't matter if you have a shitty experience on a movie. Maybe 8 people on Earth know that I had a shitty experience on that movie because I wrote about it in a book. But other than that, you don't. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. The movie itself, whatever is up there on the screen or on your TV set or on your little whatever those things are now, that's what matters. Do you like that experience of being around that movie for that period of time? And it doesn't matter if you have a good experience or a bad experience except to the particular person. Did the director have a shitty time? Whatever. I don't know.
It was such a complicated story and so many different characters and names and
oh God, the names were so terrible. Mm-hmm. I mean, terrible. But it was Bob Woodward, who was one of the writers of it, was a huge help to me. And the movie doesn't work as well as it does if he wasn't as helpful as he was, and has gone on to having a fabulous career. But it's like, just in general, whether I have a good experience or a bad experience making a movie, writing a movie. I mean, let's talk about the writing of a movie. Writing for me, my work habits are, I can't do anything until I think I know what I'm doing. And I only know what I'm doing when I know the story from beginning to end. And then what I do is, I'll put on my wall, I'll tape to the wall a yellow thing maybe with 15 or 25 numbers. It'll say interview, rain, whatever it is. And the rain means that when I'm going home today, there's a storm and some people are hurt because there's lightning. Whatever it is, right? So I'll just put a few words down, but that's really the story of the movie. So, and once I have those words up on the wall, I can write the movie. And as I said, I mean, one of my favorite writers ever, Graham Greene, very, very great writer, used to count the words. And I think he wrote 300 words a day. And when he got to his 300th word, he stopped, middle of a sentence. Green would stop, when I got my, well, that's crazy, but that worked for him. But once I know what I'm doing, once I have the notes up on the wall, I tend to be able to write fairly quickly. And that's me telling the story of the movie that I want to tell or that I think I can tell. Mm-hmm. And that's the way it works for me. Everybody else is different. I now write at home. Mm-hmm. But I had an office for years, and I'd go up there and whatever. But the main thing is it's someplace quiet. And I think that basically what we do, there are no rules for writing. As I said at the start of all this, the fact that we're talking about my writing career, the fact that this happened is just inconceivable, as Vizzini would say. Why I decided to write a novel when I had never written one, why did I want to, it's crazy. Mm-hmm. It was a bizarre experience. And it makes no sense, but here we are.
How do you tell the difference between what seems like a great idea and something that's feasible?
I just think it's something I can make play. Mm-hmm. I remember I was talking about stupid courage. I read a book when I was a little boy called Scarface, the story of a grizzly. I have no idea if it's in print. It was about a huge bear and his adventures and blah, 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 blah. And at the end of the book, Scarface is old, walking along a cliff edge. An avalanche starts. And he doesn't try and run to the end of the edge. He turns, gets up on it, and fights the rocks as they carry him to his death. Well, I couldn't stop crying for hours. And I didn't know why. Basically, it was that same thing that moves me. So basically, there are 3 famous movies that I've turned down. The Godfather, which I loved as a novel. God, I loved it. But I had just done something to do with crime. Maybe it was Butch, and I didn't want to write another crime story.
Chronologically, that feels right.
Yeah. And the second one was The Graduate, which I didn't get. The movie, I think, is wonderful, blah, 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 but I didn't get it. And the third one was Superman, which I desperately wanted to do, because I am a comic book nut. But I remember them saying, we need a star. And I knew enough to know that no movie star was going to play Superman. I met Warren Beatty once, and we were talking. He was a very smart fellow, and they wanted him to be Superman, and they gave him the costume, and I think this is true. I think he told me he went and he put it on, walked outside of his house, looked at himself and thought, what the fuck am I doing? And went and took it off. But I knew that no one, they were going to get Eastwood, but Clint Eastwood's not going to, this is a long time ago, but you're not going to get a movie star to get in that stupid costume. And I knew that, but they said, no, we're going to get a star. And of course they didn't. They got the lovely Christopher Reeve no longer with us. It was wonderful in the movie. But those are 3 movies that I look back on, and it would have been wrong. The Graduate was not a big deal. It was a small novel. Mm-hmm. But I didn't know how to make it. I didn't get it. The novel is different. I've forgotten who wrote the script. It's a hell of a script. But they made change. Like Godfather, I just can't. I remember turning down Godfather, loving it. Usually when you love something, you can't. But I think I didn't want to do a crime thing. I don't know why. I can't remember if was there another gangster movie that I had been on, or something? I can't remember what. Mm-hmm. But those are, I don't regret them. The only one I wish I'd written of the 3 that I wanted to write was the Superman, and I was too smart for the room then because they insisted on having a star. Now you wouldn't. Mm-hmm. I think if you were doing a special effects movie now, you would know enough. You're not going to get Will Smith to play Maybe you will if you're lucky, but you're probably not going to get him. You're going to get somebody unknown or somebody who's not famous yet.
Mm-hmm. Well, what about adapting? I mean, you were talking about adapting novels and adapting someone else's work as opposed to adapting your own. I mean, you've done both. You've adapted
Well,
several of
you
your own
know, I
novels.
basically when you do it, it's all the same thing. You've got to like the story. You've got to think, I can make this play. I can make this play. And if you have that confidence, I mean, I don't think any of us are ever confident about anything we write. God knows I never was. And I remember, I'll talk about Princess Bride. I don't like my writing. I should say that. I never have liked it. I don't like it. I've only liked two things I've ever written. I like Butch Cassidy and I like The Princess Bride. And The Princess Bride, I was going to California. My kids were little. I said, I'm going to be gone. I'll write you a story. What do you want it to be about? One of them said princesses. One of them said brides. I said, that'll be the title. Blah, blah. I wrote a couple of pages that I don't think exist anymore in Los Angeles. Then I came back. And I had a lot of scenes. I had the fencing scene. I had a lot of stuff, but I didn't know how to do it. And I remember walking around the city because I really wanted to write this for my children. And I couldn't make it work. I couldn't figure it out. And I was going to never write it. And then one day, I got the notion that I didn't write it. It was written by this other figure named Morgenstern. And all of a sudden, that meant I could go from one good part to another. And all of a sudden, it opened up for me. If that doesn't happen, Marathon Man only exists because one day I was walking, I think it's 47th Street. We're talking, what, 40 years ago, the Diamond District?
Mm-hmm, sure.
And in those years, it was filled with Jews who had concentration camp marks from them on their arms and stuff. And I remember walking on this street and thinking, Jesus Christ, what if the world's most wanted Nazi was walking on this street? Suddenly the rest of it happened. But if I don't walk that street that day, or if it's winter and I can't see anybody's marks, I never write Marathon. If I hadn't thought of the fact that somebody else wrote Princess Bride, it never is written. It's all fluky. How it happens, God knows. But it's always, for me, a crapshoot. It's stuff, if I don't read that paper of there are two stranglers, I never write No Way to Treat a Lady, which is what got me in the movie business. I mean, a lot of this stuff.
Is it safe is one of the great lines to me in Marathon Man.
Yeah, that worked.
Because there's an ambiguity there that you don't know for a long time.
That worked. And well, that was a great thing working for great Olivier Story, who was the greatest actor that ever lived, arguably, blah, blah, blah. He had been ill. I was working with John Schlesinger, no longer with us. Marathon Man was a thriller. John was not known for doing it, but he had done a movie that he thought was going to tank, and he thought this could save his career out here.
Was that Day of the Locust, maybe?
Maybe it was, I don't know. But he thought it was going to tank. Mm-hmm. So we're in London, and we try and get Olivier, but he was very ill with a bunch of diseases. And Schlesinger went to see him, I think, and nobody knew if he'd live. And then I remember this marvelous thing, Richard Widmark, a wonderful actor, was in London and called up Schlesinger and said, I know you want Larry, could I read for you? And Widmark got very famous in his first movie, Kiss of Death, playing an evil figure named Tommy Udo, who pushed the woman down the stairs. And he came, and he was fabulous as the evil Nazi, if you think of him in Kiss of Death. And then Olivier got strong enough to do it. And he's bald in the movie. He's bald in the book, blah, blah, blah. And we were terrified that Olivier, who was a very ill man and had been gorgeous as a young star, might not want to have all of his hair taken away. And I wouldn't have blamed him. So we had a barber, and we hid him in the basement of the place where we were doing rehearsal. And Sir Lawrence walked in and said to Schlesinger, first words out of his mouth, "We should really do something about getting rid of my hair." And so down he went to the barber, and he came back bald, and he was just fine with it.
Extraordinary.
Yeah, he was. He was the fabulous figure.
We'll talk a little bit about agents. Have you had a number of them? I mean, who have been your...
Well, look, I live in New York. I basically think of myself still as a novelist who happens to write screenplays, even though I haven't written a novel in 25 years, 20 years. And I've written a bunch of nonfiction over the last decade or so, but I haven't written a novel. I remember the first agent I had, I mentioned Joe McCrindle, who was the agent for Temple of Gold. And I think Joe became, I don't know if I have this right, we're going back a long time. Joe had been an editor, and he didn't like it because he was dealing with agents all the time. So he became an agent to deal with writers. And he went around the country when he was just starting, and he went to all these schools that had writing programs. And he picked up, I think Philip Roth, he picked up, he was a kid, and but he picked up a bunch of writers. And then Joe was my agent for several years, and then he got bored with it. And he went out and lived in Princeton. And there was a wonderful woman named Monica McCall. There were, at this time, all the big agents in New York for books were women. There was Monica McCall and Audrey Wood, and I can't think of the third right now. And they had everybody, and Monica became my agent. But I didn't need a movie agent in the beginning. And then, 8 years later, after I'd been a novel, whatever, Mr. Ziegler was a wonderful figure, graduate of Princeton, really a bright, bright man. And then he died. And so do agents really do anything? Yeah, Zig did. I mean, the auction was a huge thing. But it was an odd thing that he liked doing auctions. When he got a script that he thought he could sell for a lot of money, he would call up all the studio heads that he knew and say, "I've got this terrific script. I'm sending it to you Friday. You have to have an offer in by Monday." Boom. And that was what he did. And he liked doing that. And he was very successful at it. But agents, I don't know what to say. You need one. You desperately need one, but it's a strange life they have. Because people are always leaving them. I mean, it sounds like the world we live in, everybody's always leaving everybody. But it's fucking true. I mean, almost nobody has said, "Oh yeah, so-and-so's been my agent for 40 years. Come on. You always hear that so-and-so's a terrific, whatever it is, I don't know. Mm-hmm. All I can say is you hustle. You have to not mind rejection. You have to send stuff off to an agent with a letter and pray that somebody in the office will read it and pray that whoever reads it likes it and gives it to somebody else in the office, and somebody says, "Wait a minute, I think we can sell this," in which case you have an agent. But they're not your friends. That's not what they do. And like that. But you have to have one.
I should say, we were changing cars. We were just talking about that you have this extraordinary year where you were a judge both at Cannes and a judge at the Miss America.
My wife left me, absolutely. It was just a marvelous experience because everybody on the jury has a different job. And when we talk, we'd see each other like every 6 movies. And we talk about, did we like this? Did we like that? What about whatever? And it was so interesting, not just being around a director or an actor, but a cinematographer and an editor. And it was fascinating. It was a marvelous experience.
But you judged Cannes. It was Pele the Conqueror.
Yeah, it was Pele it was such a great movie.
Yeah, incredible movie.
It was a wonderful experience.
Now, was that during this period, there was that, you said in the 8 years prior to 78, you had 7 pictures, and then there was an 8-year desert. There was a period of 8 years, nothing happened.
Nothing got made. It was amazing.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things was, I got involved with a marvelous figure now dead named Joe Levine, and he wanted to work with me because a bridge too far brought him back.
Mm-hmm.
And he had been in the wilderness, and we did an original screenplay deal, and none of the screenplays got made. God, it's one of these things you think about it. I wrote a screenplay. This is like Butch. I wrote a screenplay about two pirates, which happened. One of them was a man named Stede Bonnet, who lived in, this is hundreds of years, lived in Barbados, and was the richest man in the island. Was married to a monstrous, very lovely woman, but evil. And he'd been in the service, but he'd never seen action. And he got very ill one winter. And he thought, shit, I might die. And he always wanted adventure. This is true. So he did something totally never done before or since. He built a pirate ship. Pirate ships were always stolen. Bonnet built his own fucking pirate ship, got his butler to find a crew, and he went off sailing to be a pirate. And he didn't give a shit if he died. He just wanted action. And through a wild fluke, he attacked the greatest pirate that ever lived, Blackbeard. And they sailed together for a while. And I wrote a movie called The Sea Kings. And I still think it's a fabulous fucking idea for a movie, because they had adventures. And, you know, they were just totally, all Blackbeard wanted to do was get enough money to retire. He was so sick of action. He was so sick of adventure. All he wanted to do was just get out of it. And all Bonnet wanted to do was see some adventure before he died. And I had these two guys as my heroes. And I still think it's a great story. Mm-hmm. And it killed me that it never got made. But it never will.
But pirates became prominent in Princess Bride.
Yeah, yeah, but I think the reason the pirates, there was a big pirate movie that tanked. Shit, I can't remember what it was.
Cutthroat Island.
They are, you know, those, oh my God, pirate movies, nobody wants to see them. Mm-hmm. And then, you know, Jerry Bruckheimer did the pirate movies, and now but it's still, I think, a marvelous story. I think what we do is write what we hope will move us. And we hope that you can translate that emotion to the reader, whether it's a poem or whether it's a novel or an essay or a movie or a play. You want to move people. And you want to have people say, wait, I didn't know that, whatever. And it's tricky. It's just tricky.
Princess Bride, though, I mean, you said that was your favorite.
That's my one. That's the one. I really love it. I really can look at it without... When I said I don't like my writing, I really don't like my writing. And that doesn't quite track into my nonfiction, because nonfiction, it's not, you know, it's not the writing style that's so important. It's what are you, you know, whatever. But when I write fiction, I really don't like it. When I look at it, I almost never reread anything I've written, because it's so horrible for me. Mm-hmm. I just don't like it. I wish it was better. But Princess Bride, I really, really like. Mm-hmm.
And Bridge Too Far was something that you said was a terrific experience.
Well, that was a great experience because Attenborough is such a fabulous figure, and it was an amazing story and a really good book, and it didn't work. It's funny, it didn't work commercially as well as it should have. Everybody loved it until the audience came. And it was long. Mm-hmm, yeah. And it was not filled with heroic stuff that you could say, oh, John Wayne would have been great in this. And
it's sort of the anti-Longest Day.
Yeah, it really was. And it was, but it was, you know, as I said, you never fucking know. Nobody knows anything. Nobody has the least idea what's going to work. And screenwriters are the basis, I think, of everything. Because if you have a shitty script, even if you had Bergman or Fellini or David Lean, it's not going to work as a movie. It just isn't. And I think everything begins with the script. And I think when you see a movie that that's not very good, one of the reasons is just the script didn't work. It's not the elegance of the prose. It's not the language.
Mm-hmm.
For me, in terms of movies, I'm talking movies, it's all fucking story. That's really all it is. If the story works, if the audience, if you're moved by whatever the goddamn story is, you have a chance to have a movie that works. And if it doesn't, if the story isn't well told or nobody cares about the story, you know, it's not going to work. It just isn't. It's going to be, you'll say, oh, you know, what, I wish I'd, you know, I'm sorry I saw that. I don't know a lot of people that walk out of movies. I tend not to. But you know half an hour in, usually, if you're bored or not. You really do when you sit there.
Well, you've always said you have to get them in the first 15 minutes.
I think so. The beginning is really what... It's a weird... If there was any logic to it, we wouldn't be here. The fact is, it's not logical, and it's very hard. I don't mean for me, it's hard for anybody to tell a quality story, to have a good beginning and a middle and an end that works and all that stuff. It's just difficult. And you look at even the greatest writer-directors did turds. And you say, why? Well, because the story they were telling didn't work. Not all of Billy Wilder was wonderful.
Right.
Some of it was. Not even Bergman, who was my hero.
Mm-hmm.
Not all of it was wonderful.
Was it because of Attenborough that you worked on the Chaplin film?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
That was because he needed work on it, and I doctored it for him, but then I got billing, I guess. But it was funny, you know, Downey, we live in a world where one could argue the two biggest action stars are not John Wayne and Gary Cooper. They're Robert Downey and Matt Damon. And that's not possible. It's not possible that Robert Downey is a giant actor. But he is. You know, and he's a terrific guy and a wonderful actor. But when we did Chaplin, if you'd said, well, he was really going to be an actor, you'd say, what are you smoking? But that's the world we live in. A lot of it is, you know, in Matt Damon, in the Bourne movies, they're marvelous scripts by Tony Gilroy. Mm-hmm. But, you know, Matt Damon's wonderful in them.
Well, speaking of Tony Gilroy, you had an experience with Tony on Absolute Power.
Absolutely. He saved my ass. The movie works. It's okay, but I was having terrible trouble. There were too many characters trying to figure out the story. Eastwood is just this fabulous figure. I remember when he said he would do Absolute Power. I fly out for a meeting on the script. And this is what it's like. He'll go through the thing and he'll say, this scene here, can it be shorter? And I'd say, yeah. He'd say, that would be good. And then he goes, and could this be funnier? And I could try. And he said, good. And all of a sudden, half an hour later, that's it. That's what he does. And talk to anybody who's worked with him. He's the fastest guy. You know, he's still, I mean, he's going to be 80 years old and he's still directing 2 movies. I don't know how he does it. But he has a crew that he's all worked with before, and it's like lightning. It's a marvelous experience when you work with him. And, I mean, I don't know how he does it. It's amazing. My theory on why Newman and Eastwood are the 2 fabulous figures that they are and were is because they did not make it when they were young. They were close to 30. Eastwood was digging swimming pools in California, and Newman was desperate to try and find any kind of work he got. And they both got lucky. Eastwood told me he was walking in a movie studio to see a friend who had a job, not as an actor, but and a guy stopped him and said, excuse me, sir, are you an actor? And Eastwood said, yes, sir. And the guy said, we're trying to cast a television show. Would you come read for us? And it was, what was the Western that he did that was so? Rawhide. Yeah. And the reason that they wanted him was because the other guy they'd already cast was really tall. So they needed a tall guy to play Rowdy. And Eastwood was tall. Most actors are short. one of the things you must know when you're a screenwriter is they're not tall.
I had the same experience you had with Sylvester Stallone.
Oh,
yes. I was staggered that he was only 5'7".
5'7", absolutely.
Yeah.
I believe this is correct. This is a story I think Eastwood told me. It's his first year on the thing on Rawhide. He comes home to his wife, whatever the wife was, and he said, I was offered a piece of shit Western today. But I turned it down. She said, what? He said, I don't know, but it takes place in Italy. And she says, we've never been to Italy. Would they pay you? And he says, oh, yeah, $25,000. She said, well, wow, we could use that. She said, okay. So he goes over, shoots this Western in Italy, comes back to Rawhide, never hears of the Western again. There's another movie that's a gigantic phenomenon all over Europe, nothing he's ever heard of. Months later, he gets a call from the producer who says, Clint, will you come while we do our sequel? And Eastwood says, to what? And they changed the title to Fistful of Dollars, and no one had told him. So he said, let me see it. So they sent him over these great big, and I think he rented a little movie theater in his town and had some friends over. He says, I don't know what this is. And he liked it, so he did the sequel, then he did the third one, and at the end of that, he was the biggest star in the world. But I mean, if he doesn't walk down that hall at that moment, who knows?
And then the consistency of his stardom.
Oh, it's amazing.
Extraordinary, over
nothing,
decades.
Nothing, never. I think he's the greatest star in Hollywood history, I really do. But then the directing is so freaky that he's become this, arguably this fabulous director at his age. It's incredible. And Newman was fabulous. He didn't direct as much as he might have. But I remember Newman did Our Town a few years. It was wonderful. Mm-hmm. But they were both late 20s, I think, when they broke through. So they had years of suffering and whatever, and I think that's why they were the decent figures they turned out to be.
The reason I asked you about Absolute Power was because you said that you had screenwriters mess around with your novels, but you had never
screwed around with them.
You never had done it to somebody else.
It's true. No, it was hard. I don't know. Sometimes you just can't do it. I don't know.
Is there anything final you want to say? Is there?
No, it's just basically it's just what we started out with. Screenplays are structure. The story, I think, is everything, and you've got to really try and do stuff you think you can make play. It's hard, it just is. You've got to do your job and don't fuck it up and don't screw around. Just do what you're. Try and tell your story or whatever they want you to do as skillfully as you can, and hope. And hope.